Hi, I'm Rob here at Jamestown Settlement. In 1623, an Englishman in Virginia wrote, "For as strong beer in England doth fatten and strengthen them, so the water here doth wash and weaken." So let's talk about the state of English ale and beer brewing in the late 16th and early 17th century. The brewing of beer has changed significantly between the late 16th century and the early 21st century, and many of the characteristics of beer that we have taken for granted have yet to be developed. So they would not be familiar to the English in the late 16th century. Today, we tend to use the terms beer and ale synonymously. But for the English in this period, the beverage of choice was ale. Ale was an unhopped fermented brew of malted grain, water, yeast. Since grain starch turns into sugar during the brewing process, not that people fully understood that part of the process at the time, and historically people were not as desensitized to the sugary foods and beverages as we are today. Ale was often spiced or bitter to cut the sweetness. This would often be done with botanicals such as common heather, ground ivy, yarrow, ginger, caraway seed, mint, and many more. Beer, though, was hopped and relatively new beverage for the English. Hopped beer was first imported into England from the Low Countries in the early 15th century, and the first recorded reference to hops grown in England is dated to the early 16th century. Beer brewing was dominated by women, especially in the rural areas of England. Brewing was not only a way to provide ale and beer to the household, but the sale of surplus beer was also a way for women to bring extra income into their family households. In England's urban areas, brewing, though, had become a trade dominated by men. The importance of ale and beer also saw the evolution of other specialized labors important to the trade and labor of brewing. Since brewers needed cask in a variety of sizes, they had typically made their own, but in 1531, the Coopers Guild gained the authority to make, inspect, and standardize casks for malted beverages. Meanwhile, maltsters became the specialized workers that oversaw the malting of grains used for brewing. To produce malt, maltsters coaxed barley into germination, then halted the germination process by toasting the malted grain. Again, much about ale and beer making has changed in the centuries between the late 16th and early 21st century. For example, we now understand that malting process turns the grain starch into sugars that the yeast consumes in the fermenting process. Although there was a concept of clean and dirty by the late 16th century, none of the science or sanitation of brewing and fermentation was understood. It was not until the late 19th century and the rise of the germ theory that the brewing and fermentation process would be fully understood. And it was the French scientist Louis Pasteur who revolutionized the understanding of beer brewing. He was the first person to understand the process of fermentation and the importance of microorganisms in the production and even spoilage of beer. In 1876, Pasteur published his groundbreaking book, Studies on Beer, in which he dealt with the diseases of beer and described how the fermentation yeast was often contaminated by bacteria, fungi, and other yeast. In Pasteur's own words, every unhealthy change in the quality of beer coincides with the development of microscopic germs which are alien to the pure ferment of the beer. Without the later knowledge of Pasteur, late 16th and early 17th century brewers relied on visual cues, smell, and taste throughout the brewing process, and many believed that the resulting fermentation was of spontaneous generation. The beginning of the brewing process is the same for ale and beer. We start with our malted grain that is cracked and is now called mash. The mash is put into clean water that is heated just below boiling and allowed to steep. Once steeped, we have a liquid known as wort, and the mash would be removed and saved. If we are making ale, we would add yeast at this point to begin the fermentation process, and then cask it. If we are making beer, we would bring the wort to a boil, add the hops to the boiling wort. Then the hops would be removed, the wort allowed to cool before the yeast is added to the beer, and then it would be cast. The mash saved from the first brew could be used and steeped again to brew another batch of ale, but with a lower sugar content, and this a lower alcohol content. The ale and beer brewed from the reused mash would be known as small beer. This small beer being a family's beverage for daily consumption. Ale and beer would be kept flat and kept at cellar or room temperature. We hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.